On the north shore of Lake Ontario, where the land meets the water in a long, flat line of limestone and gray sky, there is a building that does not fit. It rises above the lake with the confidence of something that was always meant to be permanent. Gothic revival towers, limestone walls quarried from the same bedrock beneath it, arched windows that catch the light in the morning and hold it. From the water, it looks like a cathedral. From the road, it looks like a palace. Surrounded by grounds that roll gently toward the lake, shaded by trees, planted in the 1850s and still standing, it commands the landscape with a quiet authority that has not diminished in over 150 years. This was Rockwood Asylum, built on the grounds of a penitentiary, staffed partly by prison guards, funded chronically below what its operators said they needed, and administered under a system that answered to no one who cared to look closely. It was designed, on paper, to be a place of healing. It became something else entirely. To understand what Rockwood was, you first have to understand the world that made it feel not just acceptable, but necessary. The mid-19th century in British North America, in what would become Canada in 1867, was a world organized around a single conviction, that society could be perfected through the correct application of order. This was not a fringe belief, it was the governing philosophy of the age. Poverty was not a structural condition, it was a moral failure. Mental illness was not a medical crisis. It was a spiritual and social disorder, a visible sign that the afflicted person had failed to maintain the standards that civilization demanded. And civilization, in the Victorian mind, had an obligation to respond. The response took the form of institutions, asylums, reformatories, penitentiaries, workhouses, each built on the same premise, that human suffering, properly contained and properly managed, could be converted into social order. The architecture was part of the argument. These buildings were designed to be impressive, to signal that something serious and rational was happening inside them. That seriousness, that rationality, was itself a form of power. If the building looked like medicine, the things done inside it could be called medicine, regardless of what they actually were. In Upper Canada, the region that would become the province of Ontario, the pressure on the system was enormous from the very beginning. Immigration was flooding the colony with people who arrived already broken by the Atlantic crossing, by famine, by displacement. The province's one public asylum, opened in Toronto in 1841, was overwhelmed almost immediately. By the late 1840s, the most difficult cases, those deemed too violent, too chronic, or too unmanageable for the Toronto facility, were being transferred somewhere else, somewhere with stronger walls, somewhere with experience managing people who resisted containment. They were being sent to Kingston Penitentiary. This was not a secret. The arrangement was documented, reported to the provincial legislature, and approved by the people responsible for both institutions. Psychiatric patients were being housed in prison cells, managed by prison wardens, subjected to prison discipline, and the province considered this a reasonable interim measure. Reason, in the Victorian administrative mind, had a remarkable capacity for accommodation. The interim lasted years, and in those years, the pattern was established. Mental illness treated as a problem of containment rather than a problem of care. The patient as a subject to be managed rather than a person to be helped. The institution as an answer in itself, regardless of what happened inside it. What came next grew directly from that soil. The man who built Rockwood was not a monster. That is important to say, and important to hold in mind, because the story of institutions is rarely the story of monsters. It is the story of men who believed sincerely in what they were doing, whose beliefs were sanctioned by their era, and who therefore never looked closely enough at the gap between what they intended and what they produced. John Craigeaton was the warden of Kingston Penitentiary in the years when the asylum patients were being housed in his cells. He did not design the arrangement, he inherited it. And his response to inheriting it was, within the limits of his era and his mandate, genuinely decent. He argued repeatedly in official correspondence and in reports to the provincial government that housing the mentally ill in a penitentiary was wrong, not primarily for the sake of the patients, but because it compromised the management of the prison itself. His argument was heard. His argument resulted in funding, and the funding resulted in Rockwood. The man appointed to design it was William Coverdale, a Kingston architect, whose other work included some of the region's most handsome Gothic revival structures. Coverdale's brief was to build something that looked, unambiguously, like a hospital rather than a prison. The provincial government understood, at some level, that optics mattered. The building that rose on the Kingston waterfront between 1856 and 1859 was genuinely beautiful. Limestone towers, arched windows, landscaped grounds, a long central corridor with wings extending toward the lake. It was meant to signal that the age of chains and cells was over, that what was happening here was science, that the province of Canada was a civilized place doing civilized things. The man appointed to run it was John Litchfield. Litchfield had no formal medical training. He had no psychiatric credentials. What he had was administrative experience, a relationship with the provincial government, and the belief, sincere and complete, that what the institution required above all else was order. He was not wrong about what the institution required. He was catastrophically wrong about what order, applied to suffering human beings, produces. Litchfield's methods were the methods of his time, which means they were the methods of the prison. Physical restraint, isolation, rigid routine, the removal of any stimulus that might provoke agitation. Patients who resisted were placed in restraints. Patients who remained agitated were placed in isolation. Patients who were violent were managed in ways that the institution's records describe as necessary physical measures, and that survivors, in the rare cases where survivor accounts exist, describe as beatings. And here is where the Victorian system revealed its deepest logic. Litchfield was never censured for any of it. He was succeeded by administrators who used the same methods, justified them in the same terms, and were evaluated by the same provincial authority that had approved the methods in the first place. The institution was its own evaluator. The province asked the asylum to report on the asylum, and the asylum reported that everything was proceeding satisfactorily. The first scandal broke in 1859, the same year the main building was completed. A provincial inspector, conducting what was described as a routine review, noted in his official report that patients were being kept in conditions inconsistent with the principles of moral management, the Victorian psychiatric philosophy that held that the mentally ill could be healed through calm, kindness, and structured routine. The inspector's report was filed. It was read. It was acknowledged in the legislature. No one was dismissed. No conditions changed. The institution continued. That gap between what was documented and what was done is the real architecture of Rockwood. The buildings were limestone and mortar. The institution was made of that gap. Before the darkness settled permanently into those limestone walls, there was a period, brief and genuine, when Rockwood came close to what it had been designed to be. In the early 1860s, a new superintendent arrived who had, unlike his predecessor, actual medical training. Dr. Charles Metcalf, no relation to the later William Metcalf, who would feature so differently in this story, had trained in Edinburgh and had encountered the moral management philosophy in its most serious form. He arrived at Rockwood with genuine intentions and implemented changes that, for a few years, produced measurable results. He expanded the grounds program, allowing patients to work in the institution's kitchen gardens, which ran along the lakeshore in a series of walled enclosures that produced vegetables for the institution's table. He organized evening programs, readings, simple musical performances, structured activities that broke the monotony of confinement. He hired a matron for the female ward, who had actual experience in nursing. He reduced the use of physical restraints and documented the reduction in his annual report to the province with numbers. In 1861, 43 patients had been placed in mechanical restraints. By 1864, the number was 9. The female patients, in particular, experienced something in these years that the records describe with a specificity that makes it vivid even now. In the summer of 1863, a group of 12 women from the female wing were escorted to the lake shore on a Thursday afternoon. They sat on the limestone outcroppings at the water's edge. One of them, her name is recorded in the matron's log, only as MT, age 34, admitted for melancholia, put her hand in the water and held it there for a long time. The matron wrote, "She appeared for the first time since admission to be at peace." That woman's name was never fully recorded. What happened to her afterward is not documented. The lake is still there. The limestone outcroppings are still there. The moment she put her hand in the water is all that survives of her. The provincial legislature received Metcalf's annual reports with appreciation, but not with money. The funding that would have allowed his reforms to become permanent, more trained staff, expanded facilities, proper heating for the winter dormitories, was approved in principle and repeatedly deferred in practice. The province was growing, its demands multiplying, and Rockwood was an expense whose outcomes were difficult to quantify in the terms the legislature understood. When Metcalf left in 1866, citing health reasons and the impossibility of continuing without adequate resources, the reforms he had built left with him. The institutional logic, order above all, containment as care, reasserted itself within months, and the building, which had briefly held something close to its original promise, returned to what it had always been underneath. The world outside Rockwood changed dramatically in the 1860s and 1870s. Confederation came in 1867. The new Dominion of Canada had a parliament, a federal government, a sense of national ambition expressed in railways and westward expansion, and the rhetoric of progress. None of this reached the limestone building on the lakeshore in any meaningful way. What reached Rockwood was more patience. The province's population was growing, the stresses of industrialization and immigration were producing exactly the kinds of social breakdowns the asylum had been built to absorb, and the building was chronically, perpetually, dangerously overcrowded. The patient population that the building had been designed to house at a level of approximately 200 had, by the mid-1870s, grown to over 350. The beds were not adequate. The heating was not adequate. The staff, many of them drawn from the same pool as the penitentiary next door, some of them literally reassigned prison guards, were not adequate. The administration of the institution had passed, by this point, to Dr. William Metcalf, and the similarity of his surname to his predecessors is one of those coincidences that history produces to confuse the record. This William Metcalf was a different kind of man. He was not without professional credentials. He was not indifferent to the theory of psychiatric care, but he was a man who had absorbed, thoroughly and completely, the conviction that his primary obligation was to the institution's reputation rather than to the patients inside it. His annual reports to the province were models of administrative self-presentation. They described a well-run facility making steady progress. They presented statistics of recovery and discharge that were, as a later investigation would establish, significantly optimistic. They contained no mention of the iron restraint cuffs used routinely in the male wards, no mention of the cells in the basement of the East Wing where patients judged particularly difficult were placed in isolation for periods that the records, the actual ward records, not the annual reports, show sometimes extended to weeks. No mention, in any annual report filed during Metcalf's tenure, of John Nolte. John Nolte was a laborer. He had come to Kingston from County Clare, Ireland, in 1858, one of tens of thousands who crossed the Atlantic in the years after the famine. He worked on the docks and later on road construction. He was admitted to Rockwood in 1865. The admission record describes him as displaying erratic behavior, violence of manner, and an inability to conduct himself in a fashion consistent with the demands of employment. He was 31 years old. In January of 1872, John Nolte died chained to a wall in an unheated cell in Rockwood's East Wing. His body was not discovered for 3 days. The ward record for that period, one of the documents that survived the decades of administrative reorganization that followed, notes his death in 3 words: Nolte, J., deceased. The cause is not recorded. The circumstances are not recorded. The 3 days are not recorded in any official document. They are recorded in a letter written by another patient, a man named Thomas Garrett, a former school teacher admitted for what his file describes as melancholia following financial ruin, who witnessed the discovery and wrote about it to his brother in a letter that was confiscated by the institution, held in the files, and not read by anyone outside the institution for over 80 years. Garrett wrote, "They found him on a Wednesday morning. He had been there since Sunday at least. The chain was still on his wrist. No one had checked. No one had checked. That is the first anchor of this story. Not a policy, not a system. One man, one chain, 3 days, no one checking. Everything else that follows is the explanation of how that was possible, and how the people responsible for ensuring it could never happen were the same people who ensured it continued. The physical transformation of Rockwood, from the briefly hopeful institution of the early 1860s to the overcrowded, understaffed, and systemically brutal place it had become by the 1870s, was not dramatic. It was incremental. It happened the way institutional decay always happens, slowly enough that each individual step seemed manageable, and fast enough that the cumulative result was catastrophic before anyone in authority had formally acknowledged that anything had changed. The building itself remained beautiful from the outside. The limestone facade, the gothic towers, the grounds rolling toward the lake. None of this changed. What changed was the interior. The dormitories that had been designed for 30 patients held 50, then 60. Beds were added until there was no longer room to walk between them. The heating system, cast iron pipes running from a central boiler, had been sized for the original population and had never been upgraded. In winter, the rooms at the ends of the wings, furthest from the boiler, were cold enough that patients' breath was visible in the air. The East Wing basement, where difficult patients were placed, had no heat at all. The female ward, which had briefly flourished under the matron hired by Charles Metcalf, had reverted to the institutional minimum. One staff member for 30 patients, no programming, no outdoor time in winter, no activities beyond the institutional routines of meals and sleep. The lakeshore walks stopped. The garden work contracted to a handful of male patients deemed physically capable and sufficiently docile. The iron key that hung on a hook outside the superintendent's office, the key to the administrative wing, the key to the filing cabinets, the key to the records that documented what was actually happening inside the wards, was carried exclusively by Metcalf and his deputy. No inspector, no provincial official, no outside observer had access to the actual ward records. The annual reports were the public face of the institution. The ward records were the institution's private truth. And through the dormitory windows, in the rooms where patients lay in the dark in winter, you could see, if you were standing on the grounds at night, the lights of Kingston Penitentiary burning steadily to the west. 2 institutions, the same property line, the same logic of containment, one of them honest about what it was. In 1885, a provincial inspector named Joseph Langmuir conducted a review of Rockwood Asylum that was, by the standards of the era, unusually thorough. Langmuir had been appointed to the Board of Inspectors of Prisons, Asylums, and Public Charities in the aftermath of a series of prison reform debates in the provincial legislature, and he arrived at Rockwood with a mandate that was slightly broader than the usual rubber stamp review. He spoke to staff. He examined the ward records, not the annual reports, but the actual ward records. He walked through the dormitories. He entered the East Wing basement. What he found, he documented. His report, filed with the provincial government in the autumn of 1885, contained the following: evidence of routine use of mechanical restraints without medical justification, evidence of patients placed in isolation for periods exceeding 14 days without review or documentation of necessity, evidence of a heating system inadequate to maintain survivable temperatures in the East Wing in winter, evidence that the patient population exceeded the building's capacity by at least 40%, evidence that staff, some of them former penitentiary guards, were using physical force in ways that went beyond any legitimate definition of restraint, and evidence that the institution's annual reports, filed by Superintendent William Metcalf, had systematically misrepresented the conditions inside the wards. The report was filed. It was received by the provincial government. It was read by the minister, responsible for public institutions. It was discussed. The parliamentary record shows references to it in debate. And then it was quietly set aside. No investigation was ordered. No charges were laid. No staff were dismissed. Metcalf was not called to account. 18 months after the report was filed and buried, the provincial government awarded Dr. William Metcalf a formal commendation for distinguished service to the province's institutions of public care. The same man, the same institution, the same conditions that Langmuir had documented with his own eyes. A commendation for distinguished service. That is the nature of institutional protection. It is not dramatic. It is not a conspiracy with secret meetings and destroyed documents. It is a government deciding, without formal discussion, that the cost of accountability, the administrative disruption, the political embarrassment, the admission that the thing they had been praising for 2 decades was something other than what they had claimed, was higher than the cost of the alternative. The alternative was the patients in those beds. The government knew their price. It was nothing at all. While the provincial government filed Langmuir's report and moved on, something was already changing inside Rockwood. Not because of official action, but because of a single woman who had walked into the institution in 1882 and had not been able to walk away from what she found there. Her name was Elizabeth Doyle. She was not a reformer by profession. She was a volunteer visitor, one of a small group of women attached to a Kingston church who visited the asylum on a monthly basis to read to patients and distribute small gifts, a practice that the institution tolerated because it cost nothing and generated goodwill in the community. Elizabeth Doyle was, by the accounts that survive, a woman of unremarkable background and extraordinary persistence. She had no professional qualifications. She had no political connections. What she had was a notebook, which she carried on every visit, and in which she wrote, in careful, small handwriting, what she observed. She observed that a woman she knew only as Margaret had been placed in the same chair, in the same corner of the female ward common room, on every one of her monthly visits over the course of a year. A woman who, the staff told her, had been placed there after becoming unmanageable, and who had received no other treatment or intervention in that time. She observed that the man who distributed the evening meal in the male ward struck a patient across the shoulders with an open hand when the patient reached for a second piece of bread. She observed that a patient who had been listed in the annual report as discharged improved was, in fact, still present in the ward 3 months after his listed discharge date. Listed, but not gone. Not gone at all. She wrote all of it down. And in 1886, 1 year after the Langmuir report had been buried, she sent her notebook to a journalist at the Kingston Daily Whig. The story ran across 3 editions in March of 1886. It named no individual staff members by name. The journalist, cautious about libel, had pulled back from the specifics, but it described conditions at Rockwood with enough detail that readers who had any connection to the institution recognized exactly what was being described. It named the gap between the annual reports and the reality inside the wards. It named the patient listed as discharged who was still sitting in his bed. The provincial government's response was to note that the matter was under review and that the Board of Inspectors maintained rigorous oversight of all public institutions. The matter was not under review. The oversight was not rigorous. 3 weeks after the articles ran, Elizabeth Doyle's visiting privileges at Rockwood were revoked. The official reason given was administrative restructuring of the voluntary visitor program. Her notebook was never returned to her. Music. To understand what was done inside Rockwood, systematically, with institutional sanction over decades, you have to understand what it meant to be admitted. Admission to Rockwood in the latter half of the 19th century required a certificate signed by a justice of the peace and countersigned by a medical practitioner. In theory, this was a safeguard against wrongful commitment. In practice, in a province where justices of the peace were appointed figures embedded in local social hierarchies, and where medical practitioners were often the same men who had referred the patient in the first place, the certificate was closer to a formality than a protection. The categories of admissible condition were broad enough to encompass almost any behavior that disrupted the social order. Mania and melancholia were the most common diagnoses, but the admission records also include moral insanity, a diagnosis that meant, essentially, persistent behavior that those around you found unacceptable, erotomania, religious excitement, and the particularly elastic general paralysis, which was applied to patients whose primary presenting condition was poverty, and whose cognitive state was, by the accounts in their files, entirely intact. Once admitted, a patient had no legal mechanism for contesting their commitment. There was no review process, no tribunal, no right to independent examination. The institution determined when and whether a patient was ready for discharge, and the institution's determination was not subject to appeal. The result was a population that included alongside those who were genuinely and severely mentally ill, a significant number of people who had been committed for reasons that had nothing to do with psychiatric illness. Inconvenient wives, troublesome employees, elderly relatives whose families had run out of patience or resources, immigrants whose behavior seemed strange to neighbors who did not share their language, women who had displayed too much independence, or too much grief, or too much of anything that the men around them found uncomfortable. The sleep rooms in the East Wing were not described as sleep rooms in the official records. They were described as rooms for the supervision of acutely disturbed patients. They were small, stone-walled, with heavy wooden doors that locked from the outside. The furniture was a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame bolted to the floor. The window was a narrow horizontal slit near the ceiling, admitting light, but preventing any view of the outside. In these rooms, patients were placed when they were deemed too agitated for the main wards. Some were placed there for hours. Some remained for weeks. The determination of when a patient was ready to return to the general ward was made by whichever staff member happened to be on duty, with no formal criteria and no documentation requirement. The mechanical restraints in use through most of Rockwood's operational history were leather cuffs attached by chains to iron rings set into the walls at intervals in the main dormitories. These had been installed in the original construction and were, by the 1870s, considered standard equipment in institutions of this type across the British Empire. In practice, they were used not only for patients who posed a genuine physical danger, but for patients who were loud, who refused to eat, who asked repeatedly for things that could not be given them, who cried at night and disturbed the ward. The ward records, the actual ward records, not the annual reports, show that in a single week in February of 1878, 14 patients were placed in restraints for reasons that the records describe as disturbance of ward order. 14 patients, 1 week, 1 February, and the February before that, and the one before that. The electroconvulsive equipment that would become the signature instrument of institutional abuse in the following century had not yet arrived at Rockwood. What Rockwood had instead was simpler, older, and in some ways more completely revealing of the institutional logic beneath it. The hydrotherapy tank, which was not at Rockwood what it had been at the European institutions where it originated, not the warm water therapeutic bath of moral management theory, but cold immersion. Patients placed in cold water for periods of up to an hour as a treatment for agitation, a practice that functioned less as therapy than as punishment. And that was documented in the ward records with the same flat clinical language as any other intervention. One ward record from 1881 notes that a patient identified only by initials, RM, female, age 44, admitted for mania, was placed in the hydrotherapy tank on 11 separate occasions in a single month. 11 times in 1 month, RM was held in cold water. The record does not describe whether the agitation diminished. It records only that the treatment was administered. The record does not record her name in full. The record does not record what she was like before she came. The record does not record what happened to her after. But some patients had names, and some of those names survived. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Margaret Connors was 47 years old in 1873 when she was admitted to Rockwood. She had been a seamstress in Kingston, a widow with 2 grown children, and she had been committed on the certificate of a local justice of the peace, who described her presenting condition as persistent delusion and inability to conduct herself in domestic order. Her daughter, in a letter preserved in the family's records and later donated to the Queen's University archives, described what actually precipitated the commitment. Her mother had refused to leave the house she had shared with her late husband after the landlord, a man with political connections to the certifying justice of the peace, decided he wanted the property vacant. She was 47 years old, and she had refused to leave her home. She was certified insane within 30 days. Margaret Connors spent 11 years at Rockwood. She was placed in mechanical restraints on at least 9 documented occasions. She was subjected to cold immersion. The ward records use the word bathed, a word that does its own kind of violence to the reality, on at least 14 occasions. When she was finally discharged in 1884, her daughter wrote again, "My mother does not know me when I come. She does not speak except in very short sentences. She will not go near water. When I put a cup of tea on the table in front of her, She pushes it away and will not touch it. She was not like this before. She was not like this at all. No compensation was ever paid to Margaret Connors or her family. No inquiry was conducted into the conditions of her treatment. She died in 1889. She is buried in an unmarked grave in a Kingston parish cemetery. Her name was not recorded in any of Rockwood's official commemorative materials. Thomas Garrett was the schoolteacher who wrote the letter about John Nolte, the man who died chained to the wall. He had been a schoolmaster in the village of Bath, west of Kingston, until 1864, when a series of financial catastrophes, a crop failure that devastated the community, and with it, his school's funding, followed by a failed investment in a milling enterprise, left him bankrupt. His admission record at Rockwood, where he was committed in 1865, describes his condition as melancholia with tendency toward violent ideation. His letters, the ones that were not confiscated, describe a man who was depressed, profoundly, genuinely depressed, in the way that the mid-19th century had no effective treatment for and limited vocabulary to describe. But he was not violent. He was not delusional. He was a man who had lost everything he had built and could not, in the winter of 1864, see a reason to continue. He remained at Rockwood for 6 years. In that time, the depression that had brought him there was, by any measure available to us, in the letters and ward records that survive, neither treated nor diminished. What the records show, instead, is a man being managed, placed in restraints when he became agitated, placed in isolation when he became resistant, assigned to garden work when he was deemed stable enough to go outdoors. No, correspondence to his family was permitted in the first 2 years. When correspondence was finally permitted, the letters were read by the institution before being sent. He was discharged in 1871. His discharge record describes him as improved. His first letter to his brother after discharge, written from a rooming house in Kingston, where he had found work as a copyist, says, "I do not know what improved means in their language. I only know that I am out. I do not know what I was before. I can only just remember being someone who taught children their letters, and that person seems very far away." He never returned to teaching. He worked as a copyist, and later as a clerk, until his death in 1893. He never received any acknowledgement from the province of what had been done to him. His letter about John Nolte, the letter that was confiscated and held in the files for 80 years, was discovered by an archivist at the Queen's University Archives in 1957. It is the primary document of John Nolte's last days. Sarah Hagan was 19 years old in 1877 when she was admitted to Rockwood. She had emigrated from County Galway 3 years earlier and had found work as a domestic servant in a Kingston household. Her admission was triggered by what her employer described as fits of religious excitement and refusal to perform her duties. Her ward file contains a note in different handwriting from the rest of the records, possibly a nurse, possibly a junior doctor, that reads, "Patient appears rational and coherent in conversation." States she was praying and her employer objected. Sarah Hagan spent 4 years at Rockwood. She was placed in cold immersion on at least 8 documented occasions. In 1879, she contracted typhoid fever during an outbreak in the female ward, an outbreak that the annual report for that year describes as a minor health disturbance affecting a small number of patients, managed effectively by the institution's medical staff. 17 patients contracted typhoid. 3 died. Sarah Hagan survived, but the fever left her with a partial hearing loss in her left ear, and what her discharge record describes, in 1881, as a marked diminishment of vitality. She was discharged to a charitable organization in Kingston. The organization's records show she worked as a laundress for several years before those records run out. What happened to her after is not known. She was 19 when she went in. She was 23 when she came out, partially deaf, with what a 19th century medical record called a diminishment of vitality, a phrase that means she was less than she had been. She had gone in for praying. No inquiry was conducted into Sarah Hagan's commitment or treatment. No compensation was ever paid. Her name does not appear in any official documentation of Rockwood's history produced by the province of Ontario. These 3 stories represent hundreds more. Many patients who passed through Rockwood's wards left no record that survived. Many were committed under initials only, their full names lost to institutional practices that did not bother to preserve the identities of people it did not consider worth preserving. Many families, carrying the shame that Victorian society attached to mental illness, never spoke of what had happened to their relatives at all. The silence was the institution's greatest ally, the silence of patients who could not speak, and the silence of families who chose not to. Their names deserve to be said out loud. They have now been said. The question of what Rockwood's administrators knew, and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with what they knew, is one that the surviving records answer with uncomfortable precision. They knew. The ward records that survived the multiple administrative reorganizations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries make this clear. The same ward records that documented restraint use, isolation periods, and cold immersion applications were in the same filing system as the annual reports that described none of it. The superintendent who signed the annual reports also had access to the ward records. This was not a case of one hand not knowing what the other was doing. This was one hand writing the truth and the other hand writing something else. In 1885, when Joseph Langmuir's report documented systemic abuse and was presented to the provincial government, the minister responsible wrote a note in the margin of his copy of the report, a note that was preserved with the document in the provincial archives and was accessed by a researcher in the 1970s. The note reads, "This must not become a public matter." 5 words. This must not become a public matter. No order for destruction of documents followed, not immediately. The files were simply retained in the institution's own custody, where no outside party had access, and the annual reports continued to describe a well-run facility. The ward records continued to document what was actually happening. The two sets of documents coexisted in the same filing system, separated only by the certainty that one would be read and the other would not. When Rockwood's administrative structure was reorganized in the early 20th century, following the formal transfer of provincial asylum administration to a new Ontario government ministry, a significant number of patient files from the institution's earliest decades were destroyed in what the ministry's records describe as a routine archival culling to manage storage capacity. The files destroyed were, disproportionately, from the period 1865 to 1885, the decades when the worst documented abuses had occurred. John Nolte's name does not appear in the files that were destroyed. It survives only because Thomas Garrett wrote a letter that was confiscated and filed rather than sent, and then overlooked when the culling occurred. John Nolte's name survived because of a bureaucratic accident, because the letter that contained his name was filed in the wrong category, and therefore not culled with the others. If the letter had been filed correctly, his name would be gone. The 3 days he spent chained to a wall while no one came would be gone. He would be a number in the mortality statistics for January 1872, and the cause would be listed as natural causes. And that would be all. The active destruction of the earlier files, the deliberate suppression of Langmuir's report, the revocation of Elizabeth Doyle's visiting privileges, these are not disconnected events. They are a system designed to ensure that the gap between the annual reports and the ward records remained invisible. The people who operated that system did not think of themselves as criminals. They thought of themselves as administrators, protecting an institution from unfair scrutiny. The distinction between those two things is the difference between how they saw themselves and what they actually did, music. The story of what was done inside Rockwood did not remain entirely hidden. It surfaced, in fragments, over decades, through the work of archivists, historians, and in one case a parliamentary committee, in a process of partial disclosure that was as revealing as the original concealment. The first sustained public examination came in 1908, when a reforming provincial government under James Whitney ordered a broad review of the province's asylum system. The review, conducted by a commission that included Dr. C.K. Clarke, one of the founding figures of Canadian psychiatry, visited Rockwood and produced a report that was considerably more candid than anything the institution had generated about itself. Clarke's commission described overcrowding, inadequate staffing, facilities entirely unsuitable to the proper treatment of the mentally ill, and a patient classification system that had not been meaningfully updated since the institution's founding. The Commission's recommendations included expanded facilities, professional staff training requirements, and the introduction of a formal patient advocacy process. The government accepted the recommendations in principle, Over the following decade, some physical improvements were made. The patient advocacy process was not implemented. The staff training requirements were partially implemented and then quietly allowed to lapse. In 1957, the archivist who discovered Thomas Garrett's letter about John Nolte brought it to the attention of a history professor at Queen's University. The professor published a brief article in the university's journal describing the letter and its implications. The article received no coverage in the general press. The provincial government did not respond to it. In 1978, a researcher named Patricia Jason, working on a doctoral dissertation on 19th century Ontario asylum history, gained access to a substantial portion of Rockwood's surviving ward records through a Freedom of Information request that had not been anticipated by the ministry's filing system, and was, her later account suggests, approved by a junior official who did not understand the sensitivity of what he was releasing. Her dissertation, published in 1981, provided the first systematic scholarly account of the gap between Rockwood's annual reports and its ward records. It named Langmuir's suppressed report. It named the 1908 Commission's unfollowed recommendations. It documented the archival culling of 19005. The provincial government did not respond to it. In 1992, a brief reference to Rockwood appeared in a report by the Ontario government's own Advocacy Commission, established in the aftermath of a series of scandals involving contemporary psychiatric facilities. The report noted, in a single paragraph, that historical abuses in Ontario's psychiatric institutions had never been formally acknowledged by the government. It recommended a formal acknowledgement. The recommendation was not implemented. In 2001, a coalition of patient advocacy organizations submitted a petition to the Ontario legislature requesting a formal governmental apology to the survivors and descendants of patients who had been subjected to abuse in Ontario's historic psychiatric institutions. The petition received a committee review. The committee produced a report that used the language of regrettable historical practices and the limitations of the medical understanding of the time. It did not recommend an apology. It did not recommend compensation. The government of Ontario has never formally acknowledged what happened at Rockwood. No apology has been issued. No compensation program has been established for the descendants of patients whose records document what was done to them. The language of regrettable historical practices and limitations of the medical understanding of the time remains the official position, a position that is precisely calibrated to express something that sounds like acknowledgement while committing to nothing at all. The minister's marginal note from 1885, "This must not become a public matter," has been honored in its essential function ever since. What was done at Rockwood did not die with Rockwood. The institutional logic that produced it, the logic that equated containment with care, that placed the management of the institution's reputation above the welfare of the people inside it, that treated the gap between stated purpose and actual practice as an administrative problem rather than a moral one, did not stay behind those limestone walls. It traveled. It traveled first along the most obvious route, to the other provincial asylums that operated under the same administrative framework, the same funding structure, and the same inspection regime that had allowed Rockwood's conditions to persist for decades. The Toronto Asylum, later renamed the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, generated its own scandals through the late 19th and early 20th centuries that followed the same pattern: documented abuse, official review, suppressed report, commendation for the superintendent, the Provincial Hospital in London, Ontario, the Hamilton Asylum. The pattern was not unique to Kingston. Rockwood was not an aberration. It was the template. It traveled further into the psychiatric reform movement of the early 20th century, or rather, into the gap between that movement's rhetoric and its practice. The mental hygiene movement that swept North American psychiatry in the 1910s and 1920s spoke the language of science, of evidence, of humane treatment, of the asylum as a therapeutic rather than custodial institution. What it produced in practice was a new generation of institutions that used updated methods: hydrotherapy replaced by insulin coma therapy, mechanical restraints replaced by chemical ones, within the same fundamental structure: patients who had no voice, families who had no access, governments that evaluated institutions by their own reports. It traveled into the specific history of Canadian Indigenous patients, who were committed to provincial asylums at rates disproportionate to their population, and who, within those institutions, experienced conditions that the surviving records suggest were worse than those documented for the general population. Less access to what minimal programming existed, greater use of restraints, higher mortality rates. The documentation of this specific history is incomplete because the records were maintained by the same institutions that had reason to conceal what they showed. The incompleteness of the record is itself a form of evidence, and it traveled into the most globally visible expression of this institutional logic, the CIA's MK Ultra program, conducted partly at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute in the 1950s and 1960s under Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. Cameron's experiments, the chemically induced sleep lasting months, the electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times normal intensity, the psychic driving recordings looped for 16 hours a day, were the same logic at greater intensity and with Cold War funding. The same conviction that the human mind could be remade by people with institutional authority and no accountability. The same gap between the stated therapeutic purpose and the actual destruction being produced. The same governmental response when the truth emerged. Partial acknowledgement, calibrated language, no formal apology, settlements designed to purchase silence rather than provide justice. From Rockwood to the Allen Memorial Institute runs not a line of direct institutional connection, but something more fundamental, a line of logic. The logic that says a person committed to an institution has forfeited the protection that society provides to those outside it. The logic that says the institution's judgment about what is done to its patients supersedes any other judgment, including the patient's own. The logic that says the gap between what the institution says it does and what it actually does is an internal matter, and internal matters are resolved internally, and the resolution is that the institution continues. That logic was not invented at Rockwood, but Rockwood was one of the places where it was perfected, and it did not stay in Kingston. The building still stands at the corner of King Street West and Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard in Kingston, Ontario. The Gothic Revival towers are intact. The limestone facade has weathered to a particular shade of gray that is not quite the gray of the original stone. A century and a half of Ontario winters has done something to it, softened it slightly, made it look older than the confident Victorian institution it was designed to project. The arched windows are still there. The grounds still slope toward the lake. Inside, the building is a shell of administrative conversions. It was transferred out of active psychiatric use in stages through the latter half of the 20th century as the deinstitutionalization movement that swept North American mental health care from the 1960s onward emptied the province's asylums in the name of community care. The formal operations that had continued there under the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital name ceased in stages. The last services transferred to newer facilities in the early 2000s. What remains in the building today is a mixture of government offices, a small number of community health services, and sections that have been converted to other administrative uses. The long central corridor that once connected the main ward blocks is still there, floored now in a nondescript commercial tile that covers whatever came before. The dormitory rooms have been subdivided into office cubicles. The east wing, where the isolation cells were located, has been renovated beyond recognition. Two things survive the renovations without significant alteration. The main entrance vestibule, with its original limestone archway, still opens onto the grounds facing the lake. And in a room near the administrative wing, a room now used for storage, one section of original wall remains exposed. Its limestone blocks marked with the kind of scratches and grooves that accumulate over a century of institutional use. Their origins and authorship unknowable. There is no plaque at Rockwood commemorating the patients who suffered and died inside it. There is no memorial listing names. The provincial government's contribution to the historical record of what happened in this building consists of the 2001 committee report that used the language of regrettable historical practices and went no further. A heritage designation was applied to the building in recognition of its architectural significance, its Gothic revival design, its limestone construction, its place in the history of Victorian institutional architecture in Ontario. The designation does not mention what the architecture contained. The building is celebrated for looking the way it looks. The interior is not part of the celebration. Kingston Penitentiary, which closed in 2013 and is now operated as a tourist attraction with public tours through the historic cell blocks, stands to the west, close enough to see from the asylum's grounds on a clear day. The penitentiary has a museum. The penitentiary has interpretive signage. The penitentiary has a gift shop. The asylum stands silent, converted to offices, its windows reflecting the lake in the afternoon light, with nothing on its walls to say what happened inside them. Music. There are two Rockwoods, two lives lived by the same building, separated by decades of institutional evolution, but connected by a logic that neither one of them ever formally repudiated. The first Rockwood was built by a colonial government that genuinely believed in the way that Victorian colonial governments believed things, which is to say completely, and without the complicating friction of the experiences of those affected, that it was doing something humane. The patients committed under that first Rockwood were committed into a system that thought of itself as progressive. The annual reports were not cynical fabrications. They were the institution's sincere self-understanding, which happened to be catastrophically wrong about what was actually occurring in the wards. The first Rockwood's worst feature was not malice. It was certainty. The certainty that the people inside it were being helped, and therefore the details of how they were being treated did not need to be examined too closely. The second Rockwood is the one revealed by Langmuir's report, by Thomas Garrett's letter, by Elizabeth Doyle's confiscated notebook, by Patricia Jason's dissertation, by the archival culling of 1905, and the marginal note of 1885. The second Rockwood knew. It knew the gap between the annual reports and the ward records, and it maintained that gap deliberately. And it protected that gap with the instruments available to it: suppressed reports, revoked visiting privileges, destroyed files, calibrated language. The second Rockwood is not a story about the limitations of Victorian medicine. It is a story about institutional power, choosing its own survival over the welfare of the people it was built to serve. Both Rockwoods occupied the same limestone building, beside the same prison, on the same shore of the same lake. The first produced the second, not through malice but through the structural logic of institutions that answer to no one who is willing to look. That is not a historical curiosity. It is a mechanism. It has been observed in operation, in different buildings in different decades, in this country and in others, in institutions that called themselves hospitals, and in programs that called themselves science. The mechanism does not require monsters. It requires only the decision, made by people with authority over other people, that the internal version of events is the one that matters. The questions that cannot be answered still wait in those limestone walls. How many patients passed through Rockwood whose files were destroyed? How many commitments were made for reasons that had nothing to do with psychiatric illness? How many of the mortality records, the flat notations that record a death without a cause or a circumstance, contain, in their blankness, something closer to what happened to John Nolte? How many families have living descendants who carry, without knowing its source, the damage done in those wards? Will the government of Ontario ever offer a formal apology? Will the descendants of the patients, whose names appear in the surviving ward records, ever receive acknowledgement from the institution that held their grandmothers and great-grandfathers and stripped them of their names and their time and, in too many cases, the people they were before they went in? The truth is still partially assembled. The full record was deliberately made impossible. And the institutional silence that began with a 5-word marginal note in 1885 has not, in any of its essential commitments, been broken. The iron key that hung on a hook outside the superintendent's office was the symbol of what Rockwood told itself it was: order, care, the responsible management of suffering. A tool for keeping things safe. Everything that the key opened, the filing cabinets, the administrative wing, the records that documented the truth, was controlled by the same hand. The patients had no key. Their families had no key. The inspectors who found something wrong and were told to find a different way to describe it had no key. The key stayed where it was, on its hook, on the superintendent's side of the door. There are buildings that hold their histories in their stone. Rockwood holds its history in the gap between what is documented and what was done, in the files that survived by accident, and the files that were destroyed by intention, in the names that made it through, and the names that did not. Some places are built as monuments to what a society believes about itself. Others become monuments to the distance between what a society believes and what it does. Rockwood is both, and the key is still missing.